So thank you all for coming. It's a true pleasure for me to be here. So obviously we all share one common theme, which is the great Chicago economics. And so I'm really delighted to be here. Today I want to talk about some really striking trends that we observe in the data. So I'm a macroeconomist, and I do research on economic growth, innovation, and productivity. And the questions that I try to typically ask is, what kind of policies can we adopt in order to make the countries do better, perform better? First, trying to ask some positive questions, of course. Why are we observing these tremendous differences across countries, not in terms of the levels, but also over time performances of those countries? And then the next question is, what kind of policies should we adopt to somehow improve the conditions? And my approach typically starts from data. Obviously, in an institute like this, data is a super important starting point, and that's also what I try to adopt in my research. I try to start with the data, try to put some new facts on the table that we didn't know before, and once we have those facts on the table, then I try to ask, what do these facts really tell us about policy? And there, of course, being from Chicago, one of the important tools that we always use is economic theory. So, of course, the next thing is to build some new theories to understand what can explain these observed trends in the data. And once you have a model, now you can use this model to use it as a laboratory. Of course, physicians or chemists, they have their labs to do their experiments. What do economists do? Well, we build models. We try to mimic an economy like the US economy, German economy, French economy, etc., where the firms that we model are performing just like in the data, and then we do some counterfactual exercises. For instance, what happens if you subsidize R&D? What happens if you reduce the entry barriers? What happens if you cut down the taxes or increase taxes, etc.? So this is the typical research approach that I follow with a lot of very talented co-authors and students. And today I'm going to talk about two recent papers that I've written with Sina Ateş, who is sitting in the third row there. He's a researcher at the Federal Reserve in a couple of blocks from here. So we decided to study some really interesting trends that we noticed in the data. Indeed, there's a growing literature now. Every Monday, I'm saying Monday because National Bureau for Economic Research is sending a public announcement every Monday morning to inform people about the new research. And every Monday morning, you see some new trends that we didn't know before in the US. For instance, how much companies are earning as profits, how much labor is receiving as a fraction of GDP as their income, etc. And then suddenly we realized that there are a lot of trends that we observed since 1980. And then we decided to step back and ask ourselves, what do these trends tell us about what's happening in the US economy? Because it's not one or two, there are many, many trends, secular trends that we observe. So this is going to be the name of the game today. And I will try to summarize our findings from two recent papers. And if you're interested, of course, reading more about these issues, all these papers are available on my website, which is ufukakcigit.com. So what are the trends that we observe in the data? First, the typical moments or the typical trends that we label as business dynamism shows some striking decline since 1980. So what do we mean by business dynamism? I think I'm going to be much more clear about what I mean by business dynamism, but the way I want you to think about business dynamism is, how do incumbent firms perform in the economy today? Of course, there are many, many incumbents, and how do these incumbent firms perform over time versus how do new entrepreneurs that doesn't exist yet, but they are trying to form a new company, for instance, or new firm, and how do these new firms are changing over time in terms of the number, in terms of the behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to talk about this business dynamism both among incumbents and also among new entrants. And business dynamism and entrepreneurship in the US seem to be showing some declining trends over time. In addition to this, the labor share, the fraction of GDP that goes to labor or workers as income, is also declining over time. So more and more of the GDP goes as profits to business owners. And another important observation is that market concentration is increasing quite rapidly. So market concentration measured as, for instance, the market share of the largest 4 firms in every sector, or 20 firms, 10 firms. So when you look at the top of the distribution, business activities are getting more and more and more concentrated among these largest firms in the economy. Now, is this good news? Is this bad news? So if it's, of course, good news, then we should be all happy about this. But if it's a bad news, then the question is, what should we do about this? What leads to all these observed trends in the data? Depending on the answer, of course, you're going to adopt a different policy. You cannot just go and immediately say, oh, let's split these companies, or let's tax these companies. Maybe that's, the source of the problem is somewhere else in the economy. So that's why I think it is important to go in several steps. Step number 1, let's first identify the symptoms, right? First, let's identify the symptoms in this economy. The next step is, let's diagnose the problem, if there's a problem, right? First, let's list the symptoms. Then let's try to diagnose the problem. And the third step would be, let's ask ourselves, what should we do? What kind of remedy, what kind of medication should be prescribed? So that's why I think it is particularly important to go in these 3 steps, and that's also what I want to show you today in terms of these 3 steps. Now, I'm going to go into details of all these facts one by one, and the question I want to ask is, what do these facts tell us? And then, of course, just looking at those facts, it's not enough. We need to build an economic model, theoretical model, so that we can make use of all these facts. We can operationalize all these facts. Okay, so that's why I want to show you both some facts, empirical facts, but I want to also show you a framework to think about these issues, because then you're going to realize suddenly that once you start reasoning through the lens of a theoretical model, now new messages come out. And once new messages come out, I'm going to use this as a guide, and then I'm going to go back to the data and ask some new questions. I want to use this theory as a guide. Okay, so that's going to be the roadmap. Okay, without any further ado, let me dive into the empirical trends that we observe in the data. Most of these things will be about the US economy, but quite a few of these facts are also true for the European economy and also for some developing economy, but it starts to show up in different years. So we can talk more about these issues if we have time, or if you ask some questions about this. Fact number 1, market concentration in the US has been increasing since 1980. So what I'm showing here is, you look at the top 4 firms market share or top 20 firms market share. And what you see here is that for top 4, 38% of the sales used to belong to top 4 firms. Now it went up to 44. If you look at top 20, then it goes up from 68% to 74%. So you see this very significant increase in terms of the economic activity collected in the hands of the largest firms in the economy at the sectoral level. The second fact is that when you look at the average markup defined as the price per unit cost of production. I'm producing a new good, and there's a marginal cost of producing that good, and then I'm charging a price for this good. When you look at this ratio, price over cost, that ratio has been increasing. It used to be about 20%, now it went up to 60%. A massive rise in the markups that's being charged. Of course, markups are closely related to profits, but there are also some fixed cost of production, etc. So you need to do some extra work to get to the bottom of the profit before you conclude that profits are also increasing. When you look at the profit fraction of GDP, what fraction of GDP goes to firm owners as profits? It used to be around 6%, now it went up to 14%. since 1980. Okay, market concentration has gone up, markups have increased, and the profits as a fraction of GDP has increased during that time. Not surprisingly, of course, we have a fixed pie. If you think about the GDP, you split that pie into pieces. One piece is profit, another piece is the labor share. When you look at the labor share, and then of course the remaining would be the capital share, but when you look at the labor share has been trending downwards. It used to be around 68%, now it went below 60%. So workers are getting less and less of the pie as a fraction of GDP. Now, let's go a bit deeper now. Okay, so this labor share is an interesting observation, but we need to take some extra steps in order to get to the mechanism. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to look at the data at the sectoral level, and then we are going to try to relate market concentration at the sectoral level to the fraction of income that goes to workers. The previous fact was at the national level. Now I'm saying let's go to the sectoral level, and at the sectoral level, let's try to relate market concentration to the fraction of income that goes to workers. Do we see any link? Do we see a faster decline in labor share if those sectors are more concentrated? And the answer is yes. When you look at the correlation between market concentration at the sectoral level and the labor share, it's negatively correlated. So you do this exercise for many different sectors, finance, services, manufacturing. In all these sectors, you see this negative correlation between market concentration and labor income, which means that at the sectoral level, when a sector is more concentrated, labor income goes down. So it happens at the expense of the labor income. So that's something important that we need to put on the table, obviously. Okay. Another interesting fact, which is not super obvious in the beginning, but it will be very, very important to understand the mechanism. Of course, when we talk about an aggregate economy, and we typically, of course, how do you compare different economies? You typically report one number for each country, right? Either GDP per capita or the growth rate of GDP per capita. We always summarize an economy by one number. But that number consists of millions of observations in the background, okay? And of course, we are killing all that heterogeneity and when we just take the average. But I think it is informative to go deeper and try to understand how different firms are performing within an economy, because that will tell us about the symptoms or the problem more. Now, in this paper, the authors have split the labor productivity or the productivity of the frontier firms versus laggard firms. Okay? Instead of looking all the firms and average them out, let's split the firms as leaders and the followers. And when you look at the productivity of leaders and followers, the leaders are just doing fine. It's the followers that are not able to keep up. Okay, so as you can see, the leaders, the solid black line is growing over time. What's flat is the laggards' productivity is not growing. So laggards are not able to apply pressure on leaders anymore. This is another important issue. Remember, I told you that the markups are going up. Market leaders are now charging higher and higher price. And combine these two figures, if there's no pressure on the market leader, if the followers are not able to keep up with the market leader, of course, the market leader will be able to charge higher price. Okay, so that's an important observation here. We've been talking about the incumbents. Let's talk about the new entrants, because they are also the young bloods, right? They are the engines. They will be creating jobs in the future. If we don't let in young, dynamic entrepreneurs, then of course we are not going to perform well. So we have to also look at the young entrepreneurs. When we look at new business creation, the number of new businesses divided by the number of incumbent establishments or firms, it used to be around 13%, 14%. Now it's down to below 8%. Again, a decline in entry rate, which is also a very worrying observation. This won't be a huge surprise, I guess. Now, when you look at the economic activity within young firms, what fraction of employment belongs to young firms, defined as less than 5-year-old firms? It used to be around 18%, now it's 8%. Massive decline again, right? Less and less workers or less and less resources in the economy are utilized by young firms. On the flip side, it means that most of the activities are done by incumbents. Job reallocation. What do I mean by this? We love creative destruction, because when there is creative destruction, of course, we are going to eliminate bad, unproductive incumbents, and young entrepreneurs will come in with brilliant new ideas, more productive businesses, and then those firms that are exiting will release all their workers, and through the labor market, hopefully liquid labor markets, we are going to reallocate all those workers to growing job-creating companies. Okay, and this turnover, this churn is a sign of a healthy economy, and US owes a big chunk of the productivity growth from this healthy factor reallocation from less productive to more productive firms. Indeed, according to some numbers, 50 to 75% of the productivity growth is coming from this healthy factor reallocation within an economy. Now, job reallocation here is defined as job creation plus job destruction rate. We like that. But when you look at the job creation plus job destruction rate, it used to be around 35%. Now it's below 25%. Again, another symptom for declining dynamism. Another interesting observation. So I want to take a minute to talk about this. Here I'm plotting the growth rate dispersion over time. What do I mean by this? Let's assume that the US economy consists of only us in this economy. All of us in this room is running one company, and we are deciding how much to invest in new technologies or in new businesses. Assume nobody invests in anything. We are not investing in anything. We just keep producing with our existing technologies. What will be the average growth rate of firms? It will be zero. Nobody is growing. Nobody is shrinking. When we plot the growth rate distribution of this room, one by one, there will be a spike at zero. Now, let's assume that we are in a dynamic world where everybody is trying some new ideas, okay? So we are investing in new technologies. Of course, some of us win and some of us lose. Now, what will happen? Some firms will grow really rapidly, but at the expense of some firms will shrink, of course. Now, let's plot the growth rate distribution now. Instead of having a spike at zero, now some firms will start growing, but some firms will start shrinking. Now you're having a dispersion in the growth rate distribution of firms. Growth rate distribution of firms. Now I'm plotting the dispersion of this growth rate distribution. What's happening? It's going down. So there is less and less experimentation in the economy. Okay, that's what I mean by declining business dynamism. So this is just a summary. So I showed you many, many facts, but just to summarize, market concentration has gone up, average markups have gone up, profits have gone up, labor shares has declined, market concentration and labor share are negatively associated, labor productivity gap between frontiers and laggards are opening up because laggards are not able to keep up, firm entry rate has been declining, the share of economic activity among young firms have been declining, job reallocation rate, job creation and job destruction rate has been declining, and the dispersion of growth rate has been shrinking. So these are all signs of declining business dynamism. So the model that we are considering in the paper, I'm not going to show you any Greek letters. I love Greek letters. I love math, but of course, in the interest of time, I'm just going to give you an idea about what kind of theoretical model we are thinking. We build a model where there are many, many sectors. Line 1, line 2, line 3 means literally the sector. That's how we are thinking. And in each sector, there are two firms competing. For instance, in sector 1, line 1, the two competing firms are neck and neck. The competition is really fierce. But in sector 5, there is one dominant leader and there is one laggard that's really far below the leader, okay? And the competition is not intense at all in sector 5. So now let's think about how firms will try to invest in new technologies in these two worlds. In sector 1, they are competing, the competition is really fierce, but whoever is successful will capture the market. So as a result, both firms have very high hope of making money in sector 1. So that's why they will really try to escape competition and invest intensely and will try to be really dynamic to win the market. In sector 5, what will happen? Well, the market leader is already killing it. Market follower, it's really far below, and there is no hope for market follower to leapfrog the leader. So what will the blue market follower do? Will not invest because it will get discouraged. A market leader, the red one, will already relax because there is no competitive pressure. Why should I bother improving my phone service if there is not a competition in telecom industry, for instance, right? Say I'm AT&T, I'm already charging you a good amount of money. Why should I improve my technology? You're already paying me every month whatever service fee I'm charging you, right? So competition is important. And that's why in sector 1, things will be more dynamic. In sector 5, things will be less dynamic. Now, and another important thing that will influence what's happening here is that if there's some knowledge diffusion from market leader to market followers will learn from them, reverse engineer the technologies, and eventually leapfrog. So we always learn from the masters, right? In our life, we always learn from the masters. And they are the ones from whom we are trying to reverse engineer things and ultimately come up with our own way of doing things. So we are also introducing a parameter here that will capture the knowledge diffusion. Ultimately, what we do is we use this economy to do some counterfactual exercises. Why do we need this? For the following reason. Of course, we are seeing all these trends since 1980, but the question is, what happened that led to all these observed trends in the data, right? Many things happened since 1980. Right, the entry costs have risen. There have been tax cuts, which potentially helped incumbents, large incumbents in the economy. R&D tax credit was introduced for the first time in the US in 1981 at the federal level, and Minnesota was the first state to introduce R&D tax credit at the state level in 1982. Remember, everything started to trend downwards after 1980. Maybe R&D tax credit has influenced things, right? Maybe knowledge diffusion has changed over time from market leaders to followers. Interest rates have been declining. Ideas are getting harder potentially. We collected all the low-hanging fruits for new technologies. Now it's harder to come up with new technology. Maybe that's the story. Unions are getting weaker over time. Maybe that's why the labor share has been declining. So there are all these alternative hypotheses, but we have a model now, right? We have a model and we can experiment with all these alternatives. Let's say we are in 1980 US economy and let's just cut down the taxes in the model, or let's just increase the R&D benefits to incumbents and see how the model reacts. So I'm going to use the economic theory to discipline things. And here's the answer. So the first column here is showing you the direction in the data. Okay, I told you that concentration going up, markups going up, profit share is increasing, labor share decreasing, etc. Now I'm going to do a horse race between alternative stories. When you reduce the corporate taxes, you cannot explain these facts. You cannot explain these facts, only you can explain this one. What if the story is the higher R&D subsidies? Now you're able to explain only 2 facts in the data, but you're failing in the remaining facts. If you look at the entry costs, for instance, if the entry costs have gone up, of course you can explain the entry-related observations, but the rest of the observations cannot be explained. When you change the knowledge diffusion, suddenly you see that you can explain everything in the data. If there is less knowledge diffusion from market leaders to followers, now you can explain all these trends that are showed in the data. Okay, so that's very important. And then, of course, there can be other potential stories too, but this really summarizes our finding. Okay, it shows that among all these alternative hypotheses, the only one that can explain all these observed trends quantitatively, all of them jointly, is the lower knowledge diffusion, less knowledge diffusion from market leaders to followers. So what can explain this? I'm just going to conclude with this observation. If market leaders are somehow preventing the knowledge from being used by the rest of the economy, this can explain the lower knowledge diffusion from market leaders to followers. How can market leaders block the knowledge and protect it within firms if they rely on patenting or building a patent wall around their core technologies? Do we see any signs of this? Use or abuse of IP, intellectual property. This is the fraction of patents produced by new entrants. In around 1980, 9% of patents used to be produced by new inventors. Now it went below 4%, so much less patents coming from new entrants. When you look at the top 1% of patenting firms and ask what fraction of the patents are produced by the largest top 1% of the firms, it was around 35%. Now it's 50%, a massive concentration of patenting. Of course, patents are used in court when it comes to litigation, right? So if you have a strong arsenal, then you will have easier time when it comes to these frictions. When you look at the secondary market for patents, who sells, who buys patents, the largest 1% of the patents are buying the big chunk of the patents from small firms. Indeed, that number is about 55% now. A big chunk of the patents are being reallocated from small to large firms. So let me end it here. When we also look at the nature of the patents that's being produced, the nature of the patents are also shifting from being more productive patents to more defensive patents. I don't have time to go to all these details, but all these things are indicating that indeed there is some wall that's being built around firms, the market leaders, and it's much harder for the followers to leapfrog the leaders and gain the market. So as a result, this turnover, creative destruction is not taking place as it used to be in the past. So this is what we find from our research. Of course, the policy implication of this would be that we have to focus more and more on a secondary market for technologies, and we have to ensure that the knowledge is being diffused, not captured only by the market leaders, because the aggregate productivity of the US is not a function of only the productivity of the market leaders. It's everybody's productivity that leads to US productivity, right? So that's why we need to think more collectively when it comes to knowledge and new technologies. So thank you very much.
On behalf of everyone, let me thank you for this very insightful presentation. And I'm going to kick off the discussion with a very simple question. Should we break up Facebook? We're half joking here because what Ufuk kind of closed his presentation with is the post-entry distortions that impede competition needs to be removed. But the question is, what if they are part of the story? And in your paper, actually, you put them as the changing nature of production. So if there is more use of data, there is more network externalities, positive externalities for certain production structures, what do we do then? Do we break up Facebook, or do we regulate them? What do we do?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So this, we have to be careful in terms of, which part we are intervening, right? So if you go and break up Facebook, this will effectively be a very harsh success tax. Of course, all these firms are forward-looking, right? They are dominating the market based on what they've done in the past, and now the part of the concentration is due to their past success. But now you can do, at least in broad sense, you can do two things. Either you can punish and split the incumbents, in which case this is going to have some dynamic consequences, right? Because all these small firms are forward-looking. They are willing to be the future Facebook, the new Facebook, right? So as a result, if you punish the market leaders for what they produced, then this is going to have a trickle-down effect. So as a result, I think rather than punishing the market leaders, first things have to be, of course, controlled, but we have to make sure that the followers are able to enter into competition. Rather than punishing the market leader, I think encouraging followers to come and challenge market leaders is the key to think about. So that's why, for instance, thinking about, we discuss very little these parts, but thinking about, for instance, the secondary market for technologies, how easy is it to license technologies in the secondary market, right? Because all these followers should be able to access these technologies that the market leaders have. And as a result, if they're able to use it and come and challenge, then this is one thing that we have to consider. And of course, I've done this study for a number of countries. Every country has their own story, and maybe, maybe in some of your questions we might touch upon this issue. But for instance, when it comes to a developing economy, similar observations happen in some of the developing economies too. But when it comes to developing economies, typically the followers are suffering from lack of finance. They are not able to keep up because of these recent global financial crises, etc. So as a result, depending on which country you're looking at, the policy conclusion should be different. There's no one-size-fits-all policy recommendation here. So that's why I think in the case of the US, thinking about the secondary market for technology and somehow bringing the followers into the game is the way to go.
That's a great question. And one great thing about the paper, if you haven't read, do. It's really fun read. And, although, there's the model and everything that Ufuk spared you the details, but even there, it's one of an example of a very well-written theory paper. And one thing the paper does is bring it all together, right? It's not just saying, okay, this is my favorite explanation, potential, and I'm going to just build a model around that. Instead, it's informed by the data, those trends, and Ufuk listed them for you. 4 main factors on corporate taxes, on entry cost, on R&D subsidies, and decline in knowledge diffusion, but also other potential explanations that other researchers have put out there, right? And as I'm reading it, I realized that I missed one of them, which was also put out. And you have 2 references. You have the Hoppenheim et al. Paper, and you also have the Karan et al. Paper, where they are going back to the demographic origins of market power and how population dynamics affect business dynamism. So my question to you is, this has also been a big issue for us here at the fund and at the World Bank. In the past 2-3 years, in the annual meetings, in the spring meetings, we had several seminars looking into aging, implications of aging for productivity, and how do we deal with those cases. So my question is to you, how would you assess the quantitative importance of population dynamics, aging in particular?
Sure. That's another great question. So obviously, there are many facts that I showed in the data, and if you take one fact at a time, you can tell lots of different stories to explain each of these facts. And the novelty of our approach is try to combine all these facts simultaneously, because when you take one fact at a time, then you can give a different explanation. For instance, ideas getting harder can explain one fact, right? Aging population can explain the entry dynamics. So one argument in the literature has been that since the US population is aging, we have less and less young people. So as a result, this is going to imply that there will be less and less new business creation just because you don't have the young entrepreneurs anymore. That can explain the entry dynamics. I completely agree. But there are many other facts that I showed. For instance, when you look at the relationship between labor share and market concentration, they are negatively correlated. An aging population cannot explain this, right? More concentrated markets are paying less to workers. Why? Or when you look at the labor productivity of market leaders and followers, forget about new entry, new business creation. Just let's look at the dynamics between competing incumbents. Market leaders are doing fine. Market followers are not able to keep up with the market leaders over time. And then as a result, the markups are increasing. Now there's a bigger and bigger price that's being charged. You cannot directly explain this with an aging population. So I don't want to say that knowledge diffusion is the explanation for everything, because of course all these different changes in the US economy is influencing many different things. Taxes have some influence on something. Aging population does influence something. R&D subsidies do influence some part of the economy. But when you put everything together, what can speak to all these facts simultaneously is the declining knowledge diffusion from market leaders to followers. Here, when I say knowledge diffusion, I'm using this as a catch-all phrase. It's more about
the followers not being able to implement their ideas. Even though they might learn about the technology at the frontier, they're not able to implement it. So that's what I mean by reduced knowledge diffusion. It's more about reduced implementation of ideas by followers. Maybe that's how we should think about that.
That's quite convincing. At the same time, I'm going to push the demographics angle just a little bit more. As you know, the recent debate basically pits millennials against baby boomers.
Right.
And there was a June 2019 Atlantic story, and I quote, they basically put it as, the boomers ruined everything. And their explanation goes, why they ruined everything? Because zoning codes and patent litigation, licensing requirements, degree requirements for new jobs, and the political economy of it all, those were ways for boomers to seek and protect the rents. And now we're in a situation where millennials are finding it very, very difficult to enter to the market, to accumulate wealth, to be entrepreneurs, right? And you also have a paper using Italian data that's looking at this political connections and innovation and firm dynamics. So I wonder how the model you developed there, looking at Italian facts, would give us some insights in the US situation.
So I think having a theoretical framework in mind definitely helps to reason through these empirical facts. So let's think about the theoretical framework in the following sense. We are living in a world of creative destruction. Young entrants are replacing unproductive incumbents, etc. Now, let's say I came up with a new idea and I replaced the incumbent, and now I'm the next incumbent. I have two options. Either I can come up with further innovations and push the technology frontier forward to make money, or I can make sure that nobody comes and kicks me out because I'm already making money. So all I have to do is I don't get kicked out from the market. So as a result, there's this political economy aspect of things, right? As soon as I'm the market leader, now I have to adopt some defensive strategies. And in the case of Italy, we did a very interesting study, so I'm sure you're going to like this. So what we did is the following. We took the social security data of 50 million people. These are everybody for whom there's social security contribution. And then we took the data of register of local politicians. So more than 500,000 local politicians. So these are mayors, vice mayors, council members, you name it. And we merged the two data sets. So since being a local politician is a part-time job, they have to also work for a company at the same time, or they usually work for a company. So as a result, each of these active politicians who hold a chair or seat in the municipality also are working for a company at the same time. So as a result, you can see the compensation of politicians and their position in the municipality, etc. So you can ask lots of interesting questions. But one interesting question we asked is the following. We said, let's look at the largest 20 firms in every sector, largest 20 firms. And then let's ask, as a firm is becoming the market leader, what do they do in terms of new innovation? When you look at the innovation intensity of the firms, it's declining as they are becoming the market leader. So they are becoming less and less innovative relative to their size. Okay? So this is comparing the largest 20 firms. And then as you go from 20 to 19, 18, blah, 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 all the way up to 1, innovation intensity is just declining. What happens to their politician intensity? The number of politicians that they hire relative to their size, it's just increasing dramatically. When you put the two together, you see this, we call it leadership cross. Innovation intensity is declining and politician intensity is increasing. What does it tell us? Of course, they have the incentive to somehow get connected to the political system. If you're the market leader, you have to make sure that you're slowing down the turnover. Now, in the case of the US, of course, this is related to lobbying. So there are some now recent studies that shows some link between industries where there's a lot of lobbying activities. We are also seeing less turnover over time. So this is the usual, very classic political economy aspect of creative destruction. You don't want to get replaced. So as a result, you will try to do things that will protect your territory. So that's, I think, what we are observing over time, and we have to make sure that this turnover keeps going.
I have a lot more questions, but give me a hand in thanking Ufuk for the inspiring discussion, for the audience, but also Rodrigo, Karen, Pamela for making this happen, and hope to see you all again in another event. It can be tomorrow at noon. We're going to be on the 9th floor, continuing the conversation. Thank you.